Welcome back to this EWTN special presentation on John Henry Newman. My name is Father James Bradley and I'm joined here in the college at Littlemore with my friend Deacon Stephen Morgan. Stephen, before we were talking a little bit about John Henry Newman's life up until 1833 and his involvement with the Oxford movement. Perhaps now we might just turn towards his conversion, that journey that took him from his role as the vicar of the University Church in Oxford to this place, in fact, to Littlemore, where he was received into the church by Blessed Dominic Barbary in 1845.
The journey from Oxford to Littlemore to Rome is a journey that was driven by many of the concerns we've already looked at. As the members of the Oxford movement started to try and connect the Church of England in the 1830s with historic English Christianity, they ran into a number of problems. And one of the problems was that many of the bishops simply didn't see things that way. And as Newman and his friends, who had been producing, in addition to the hymns and poems that I mentioned, a series of tracts, short publications, making theological, doctrinal, devotional points, those tracts became very controversial. And in 1841, Newman wrote a tract called Tract 90. And Tract 90 was an attempt to reconcile the articles, the 39 articles of religion of the Church of England, which was a doctrinal formula that had been arrived at in the late 16th century, with the Catholic theology of the Council of Trent. The English bishops didn't like, the Anglican bishops of England didn't like Tract 90 at all. And in 1841, Newman's own bishop, the Bishop of Oxford, issued what was called a charge, like a letter from the bishop to the clergy of his diocese and the people of his diocese, condemning Newman's argument.
So I guess in a sense that would have brought about something of a crisis in Newman's thinking. He understood the church to be something of great importance in the life of the state and of society, in his own life as well. To find that your approach, the way that you're thinking, the theological path that you're on is suddenly met with resistance by your bishop would create some element of existential crisis, I suppose.
I think the Bishop of Oxford's charge was psychologically very important to Newman. Intellectually, I think he had, in some ways, loosened his moorings from the Church of England by that stage quite dramatically. Throughout the 1830s, he struggled to reconcile the fact of doctrinal change with the notion that Christian revelation was definitive in Jesus Christ. And the result of that was he had to propose various hypotheses to account for that difficulty. Now, he was aware of that problem maybe 10 years earlier, but in the 1830s this became really quite concentrated for him. And in 1839, he was shown an article that had been written by a man called Nicholas Wiseman, who went on to be the first Catholic Archbishop of Westminster, about the Donatist crisis in North Africa in the time of St. Augustine. And this deeply undermined Newman's sense of where the Church of England stood in Christianity. He began to see that the various hypotheses that he had proposed ran up constantly against the fact that Anglicanism was a local manifestation of Christianity that was not in communion with the rest of the Church.
And I think one of the ways that was described, Anglicanism's sort of self-understanding, was a via media, a sort of midpoint between the excesses of Rome and the excesses of Orthodoxy. And Anglicanism is a sort of, it's a very English thing, of course, very sort of reasonable expression of Christianity. And it's that really that it seems to me Newman found unsatisfactory at this point.
Yes, I think that's true, although in fact the via media was really cast as between the corruptions of Rome and the infidelity of nonconformism, of evangelical religion, not part of the Church of England. The problem with that, and this came out in a correspondence that Newman had with a French priest, the Abbé Yaga, was that at various points in the history of the Church, the doctrinal solution that the church came to, when it came to understand what the Trinity was, when it came to understand who Jesus Christ was as true God and true man, that the via media was a heretical position, and the church took one of the extremes. So the via media in some ways was a hypothesis to account for the difficulty, and when Newman tested it against historical reality, it failed. And so when he proposes a conclusion about the doctrine of the Church of England that attempts to make it cohere with the Tridentine synthesis of Catholicism, what he's trying to do is testing that via media, and he finds that it fails. And he finds it fails in the place that it mustn't fail, and that is amongst the bishops, because he has this notion of an apostolic church, a church founded on the witness of the apostles. He's very, very concerned to see the church as apostolical.
One of the things that the Oxford movement did is rediscover, in a sense, the church fathers. And Newman, it seems to me, was rooted in patristics, rooted in an understanding of the church from the first millennium. Would you say that recognition of the importance of the role of the bishop and that crisis that came about as a result of the charge of the Bishop of Oxford was rooted in that understanding of the church from the first millennium?
Yes, it was. He says at one point, my stronghold was antiquity, and here antiquity was arguing against his position.
Yeah.
So whilst I don't think the Bishop of Oxford's charge was the point at which he crossed the Rubicon, I think it was the point at which he could no longer convince himself or anybody else that he could stay put. And he does various things following that. He acquires Littlemore and he comes to live here. He spends his time here. He doesn't resign his fellowship in Oxford, but he comes to live here with a number of other men who he's known in Oxford who are thinking about these same issues.
Yes.
And some of them stay and become Catholics. Some of them stay, don't become Catholics until after him. Some leave, some return to the Church of England. But that period from 1841 to 1845, when he's here, he is in many ways working out his future. And he does that eventually by writing about it.
Let's now come to that moment of decision for Newman in this very room, in this very place, where on the 9th of October 1845, Newman is received into what he would call the one true fold of the Redeemer, into the full communion of the Catholic Church. His decision comes about as a result of spending those years here in Littlemore, of prayer and of study, of discussion with his colleagues. But the decision to become a Catholic is always a very personal decision. Mm. What was it, do you think, that really brought Newman to the point of asking Dominic Barbary to receive him into the one true fold of the Redeemer?
For Newman, there was a belief from a very early stage that there was a church.
Yes.
And it made no sense for there to be churches in that sense. In the 1850s and 60s, he writes letters almost constantly to people who are considering conversion to Catholicism. And Newman always asks them the same question, or at least always tells them that the decision is based on the same question. And I think that's the question he addressed himself. And that question is this: do you believe the claims that the Catholic Church makes for herself? And for Newman, if the answer was, yes, I do, as he says to the converts, then there is an urgent necessity that you join her communion. And if you don't, you should not. I think that's precisely the point that Newman had got to by October 1845, in part because of a lengthy theological work that he wrote in 1845 about this issue of the development of doctrine, which is really about identifying the identity of the Church. Is Romanism, as he would once have called it, the same as the Catholic Church founded by Christ?
Newman's received into the Church in 1845. But these theological ideas that we've been discussing, and perhaps we'll talk a little bit more about the development of doctrine, have had a long-standing effect in the life of the Catholic Church. Since Newman wrote them, they've been engaged with by theologians, they've been thought of as important. But that theological, doctrinal body of Newman's life is something which still has great importance in the life of the Church. The development of doctrine is something which I think in our own day is being discussed more widely. And I wonder if you could just be very precise about what Newman meant by the development of doctrine. How did he understand that doctrine could develop, if indeed it could?
Newman believed, as he says in the introduction to the essay on development, that the idea of Christianity has been long enough in the world for it to be accepted as a fact. Perhaps slightly inconveniently, he doesn't say what the idea of Christianity is, but I think we can reasonably assume from pretty much everything else he wrote before and afterwards that he shared Augustine's view that the core identity of Christianity was Christ who came in the flesh for our salvation. The incarnation of Christ is a definite event. And Newman writes about the development of doctrine because he has this belief, which I referred to earlier in his first conversion, that Christianity is essentially doctrinal. It can be expressed in those impressions of dogma. Mm-hmm. But any historical awareness, and the 19th century was, amongst other things, a time when people came to take seriously the study of history, pointed up that Christian doctrine had changed. The way in which Christianity expressed her truths had developed. The study of the first 5 centuries of the Church, which is Newman's stronghold, that stronghold in antiquity, is a history of the development of doctrine. And so what Newman is concerned to do, as he puts it in the introduction to the essay on development, is to demonstrate why doctrine changes in order to remain the same. There's that famous quote which we often hear about Newman, to live is to change and to be perfect is to have changed often. He sets that in the context of the idea of Christianity, being expressed in doctrinal form, changing with historical circumstances, not for the sake of changing the doctrine, but he says it changes in order to remain the same. And that's the concern for Newman throughout that whole period. If Christianity is factual and is based on the incarnation of Jesus Christ, he says these are facts and not opinions. If that's the case, and yet the Church's expression of her doctrine changes, there has to be a way of validating those changes. He refers to them as tests in 1845. He's slightly less bold about them when he comes to re-edit his works in his 70s and refers to them as notes. But those tests or notes are designed to enable us to tell the difference between an authentic development, that is a development that remains true to the original doctrine, or a corruption. And that's a strong word because he thinks that doctrine is important and the corruption of doctrine is dangerous to salvation. And so he has to find a way of working that out. He proposes these tests or notes, but in many respects what they're really about is by looking back into the history of the Church and using those tests or notes to identify what is the organ that teaches authoritatively. I mentioned that article from 1839. The thing that strikes in there is a quotation from St. Augustine, securus judicat orbis terrarum. The whole world, by which he means the Catholic Church, the whole Catholic Church judges securely. And that's what Newman's trying to find. By 1845, he's determined that he knows where that is.
Newman finds this deposit of faith, this guarantee of the truth in the Catholic Church. And Newman was received into the Church here, and I wonder if we might just start by saying something about that momentous day.
Yes, not just here, but actually in the room in which we're talking. Blessed Dominic Barbary was coming to Oxford to visit one of Newman's friends who had become a Catholic 2 weeks previously. He had no idea that Newman was going to ask to be received. But Newman had resigned his fellowship at Oriel College and had written to all his friends. When Barbary arrives in the middle of a rainstorm, in fact, on the 8th of October, Newman asks to make his submission to the Church and spends 2 days making his confession. He'd been thinking for a very long time about those things he needed to confess, and his reception into the church, as we would now call it, was attended by an intense focus on sorting himself out with God. But it marks an extraordinary departure for him. In becoming a Catholic, Newman has cut himself off from his university. He's cut himself off from his family. Two of his sisters were married to very, very devout Anglicans, one of them an Anglican clergyman who by that stage had died, and also from his friends in the Church of England. He'd some months previously preached his final sermon, which he called The Parting of Friends. So he struck out into a world that he doesn't know very well. The Mass at which he received communion here in this room, on a desk that is here in this room as well, was possibly only the second or third Mass that he'd ever been to. Very unlike the life of a convert today, who might have spent many months and even years being familiar with the Catholic community. He didn't know the Catholic community, but quite properly, because he thought bishops were important, he went to see the Vicar Apostolic. There were no diocesan bishops in England at the time. The Vicar Apostolic that covered Oxford, who was based in Birmingham, the same Nicholas Wiseman who had written that article in 1839 that had held him below the water, really, as an Anglican. And Wiseman sends him to Rome and suggests to him, because Newman is very interested in the notion of religious life, having had a kind of quasi-religious life here, a life of prayer and study and life in common, Wiseman suggests that he has a look at the Oratorians. And in Rome, Newman comes to know the Oratorians and to know the luminous figure of the Apostle of Rome of the 16th century, the great St. Philip Neri. And that determines, in some respects, the whole of the second half of his life, which is a life as an Oratorian, a life as an Oratorian in Birmingham, a city that he didn't know.
So Newman, a man of letters, a man of great intellect, of great wisdom, is sent to Rome to study to become a priest. I can't imagine for a second what it would be like to have Newman in one of your classes at the University of St. Joseph in Macau. But in a sense, that's what happened. This man of great intelligence, of great knowledge, of great faith, humbles himself really, and receives then from the church all of the church's teaching in order that he can be ordained to the sacred priesthood.
And that's an uncomfortable time for him, because the theological method that he'd grown up with, the method which a fellow Victorian convert, Henry Manning, referred as the Old Oxford Way, was very grounded in a thorough reading of the Fathers of the Church. When he got to Rome, of course, the theology that he was imbibing at the College of Propaganda was a theology that was heavily dependent upon commentaries on the theology of St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, because Newman had read greats here in Oxford, he was familiar with the works of Aristotle, but he wasn't familiar with the baptizing of that philosophy that is one way of understanding the Catholic theological landscape of the High Middle Ages. And by the 1840s, that was really commentaries on commentaries on commentaries. And he does comment that he found the whole time really rather boring. And he found the method of theology, I think, fairly uncomfortable. Was never entirely at home within it. But he wanted to be a priest. He wanted to live a religious life. And interestingly, I mentioned just a few moments ago that he went to Birmingham to start his life as an Oratorian, a place that he didn't know. As a young man, when he decided to become a clergyman, he thought that he would be a missionary. Mm-hmm. It's why he decided, even then as an Anglican, that he would be a celibate, in order that he could be free to be a missionary. Well, he wasn't sent to the British colonies in Africa or to that part of the world where I now live, which Newman is the first person to have called it the Far East. Mm-hmm. He was sent to Birmingham to minister to the poor, initially in a converted gin factory, and then in a building that was set aside and a church that was built to enable the oratory in Birmingham to be established.
And there's a parallel there as well with the life of St Philip Neri, who had, I understand, a great desire to go overseas and to be a missionary overseas, but who ended up being the apostle of the city in which he lived, the apostle of Rome. And so Newman's life, again, sort of ties in and finds a parallel with the life of St Philip Neri by being sent to Birmingham, where he founded the first oratory of St Philip Neri in England.
He did, and he also founded a school. You remember earlier we talked about him coming here to Littlemore to minister to the poor, and he built a church and he built a school. He did the same in Birmingham. Education, he writes in the 1880s, education was always his line. As a very old man looking back on his life, he could see that the education of the young and the bringing of the gospel to the poor, to the marginalised, to those on the peripheries, as we might say today, even if the peripheries were close to home, was an integral part of what he felt God called him to do.
Deacon Stephen Morgan, thank you so much for spending this time with us here in the college at Littlemore.
Father Bradley, thank you.